Uh, to study something scientifically, one needs to have outcomes that are somehow quantifiable. For this talk, I am using the quantifiable terms. Actually, these are qualifiable, which become quantifiable. Altruists and psychopaths. And to turn that into some sort of measurable or quantifiable set of data or information, then there's what we'll see a little bit later is called the empathy quotient. And it's a way of deciding whether somebody is on the good side or the bad side. I'm going to start with a pretty short course in neurophysiology, anatomy, and chemistry. So you'll all be real excited for that, including this. This has a cartoon as well for Bob. Okay. So, you each have a paper that looks something like this. And this is a drawing of two of the cells that are in the brain called neurons. Neurons exist elsewhere, but primarily that's the action part of your brain. Surrounding the neurons are what are called glial cells, and those are actually just support cells for the action cells of the neurons. They all act in a fairly similar fashion, the neurons, not the glial cells. What happens is that through what's called the dendrites, that's these things I've got around here where there are a bunch of them, something comes from another cell into the first cell, and that stuff then acts on messenger RNA, which is the go-between between the nucleus and the DNA in the nucleus and the cytoplasm, or where essentially the machinery of what the cell produces is. It's present in the cytoplasm. So basically, we got something coming in. It triggers the mRNA to go into the DNA. The DNA then tells the mRNA what it is that's to be produced. The mRNA then comes back out into the cytoplasm, and you go through a whole bunch of stuff, putting primarily amino acids together to form proteins. Proteins then determine essentially everything. They tell where you put fat, where you put other protein, where you put muscle, where your heart goes, how your heart works. All of that stuff is driven by proteins. So in the case of what happens in the brain, the proteins are then made into little pieces that then move into the next cell through what's called the axon, and then past the synapse, which is the connection or almost connection between the first cell and the second cell. There's a space in here that becomes really important, particularly for medicine, but also it's important in all kinds of other things as well, which I didn't cover in class. And in this case, what I have is that there's a green neurotransmitter. That's these things that are produced by the neuron. There's a green one coming in, and it's telling the DNA to make more green ones. Okay, more green neurotransmitters come down here through the axon to the end of the cell, waiting at the synapse. Then, as the neuron is triggered, then some of the neurotransmitters go across the synapse into the next cell, and the whole thing starts all over again. So we have two things here that are important as far as the chemistry goes. There's neurotransmitters. These are the things that go directly from one cell to the next cell. And then neuromodulators. That's what I have, these little brown checks. Neuromodulators act outside the cell. And in this case, what I'm showing is that the neuromodulators don't allow both neurotransmitters, the green ones and the red ones, to go across. They only allow the red ones to go across. There are several different ways that that can work. The neurotransmitters are released, then some of them are going to be reabsorbed back in here instead of just moving on to the next cell. And that can be adjusted by the neurotransmitters. Some of them are enhanced in moving across, and that can be adjusted by the neurotransmitters. I'm sorry, by the neuromodulators. So in other words, there's a whole bunch of stuff that can go on. That's basically what you need to know about that is. And things that are determined within the cell, the synapse, and then the fluid around the neurotransmitters, or around the neurons, all work together to get something done. Now, as this goes on, then one of the things that's important is that energy is used. And as energy is used, oxygen is used. And that'll become later on, that'll become important here when I get a little farther on. Some of the neurotransmitters, the ones most important to me with the medicine, Marlene said I do a lot of, see a lot of kids with ADHD and autism. And the things that are most important, the neurotransmitters most important to me are epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and then a lot of those kids have depression. And treating depression generally involves managing one other neurotransmitter, and that's serotonin. There's a bunch of others. There's acetylcholine, glutamine, gamma-amino butyric acid, glycerin, and then a couple of, those were the neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters can also act outside the cell and become neuromodulators. But two that you probably would recognize are Botox and alcohol. Most of us have had some action with at least the alcohol. And it definitely makes some difference in how things work. The important part of the genetics of all of this is that the two things basically to remember are that the DNA is in the nucleus and the mRNA is the connector between the other stuff, the nucleus, and back out into the cell to make what it is that the neuron makes. Now, this is your neural anatomy and physiology and chemistry. So we're going to move on now to scientific study of good and evil and sort of how this kind of thing works to define what it is that we do that makes us good or evil. Initially, the first studies or first interests about good and evil and how it's determined by brains comes from accident injury kinds of things, as well as tumors that involve the prefrontal lobes and the frontal lobes of the brain. A couple examples I gave in the National Geographic magazine that was my main thing to use for this. As a railroad worker who had a spike go through the front of his head and destroyed a big part of the frontal lobe. And then another fellow who had a frontal lobe tumor. And what happened was, a thing of importance for this was that both guys were really nice guys at the beginning. After the injury, they became pure jerks. They'd been, they would have had a high empathy quotient initially and essentially a negative empathy quotient afterwards. So people got interested in studying, well, if this part of the brain is injured, it must be the part of the brain that has something to do with personality. So then the studies keep getting more and more advanced depending on what technology is available at the time. Much of this technology, for example, there's a PET scan you can see in the upper right corner of your thank you, John, of this, and it shows the difference between a PET scan that's active in a nice person with all the red in it, and a PET scan of a person who is an admitted murderer. And the red is determined, or the red shows the amount of oxygen used by that part of the brain. So what they do with this is, they being the people who are studying such things, will give some sort of stimulus, either a picture or a story. There's all kinds of ways of stimulating such things, and then do a PET scan to see what part of the brain lights up. So where is the oxygen used? So you can see that somebody with normal brain lights up the prefrontal and frontal cortex, and people who are pathologically short on such things, it just doesn't light up. The thing that came out of this, I said I'd mention empathy quotients, and this is where empathy quotients are developed. Now there are such things as, before the scans were available, that was back when I was going to school, essentially all of the scans, the CT scan, the MRI scan, and the PET scan have all been developed within the last 40 years or so since I've been out of medical school. Rex is smiling. I think that you graduated a little later than I did. I don't know, maybe a CT scan. Okay. But anyway, these things weren't available. If they were more experimental than actually in use at the time. And now they're all commonly used scans. They have good technology and so forth. So they're easy to use. The things they're studying, the empathy quotient, can actually be studied early in life. For example, 2- and 3-year-olds, you can differentiate energy quotients in kids in preschool. And you do that by observation. The observation, for example, when Fred pulls Johnny's chair out from under him and Johnny lands on his butt and cries, and Sally says, "Oh, that's terrible," and starts to cry herself. And Alice over here says, "That's about the funniest thing I've seen all day." So you can see where the empathy quotient goes, and you can actually measure such things. And almost all of us have seen this sort of stuff growing up, whether we were the ones that were upset about the chair being pulled out or the one who actually pulled the chair out. I'm not going to go there, though. Much of empathy is determined by DNA. In other words, what your parents gave you in each of your cells is a chromosome that has genes on it that determines what proteins are put out of your body, which in the long run determines what you look like, how you act, whether you can run fast, probably even what basketball team you like in the NCAA. In any case, that it determines essentially all of those things that are us. And it was thought initially that this was sort of hardwired. In other words, you've got the DNA, the mRNA comes down, picks up a piece or copies a piece of the DNA, goes to the cell, produces the protein, and goes on. And that is always the same and never changes. Well, not too long ago, I suppose 10 or 20 years ago, there was a significant change in how people thought DNA worked. And that is that it's plastic. It's not hard. It's not a hard wire. So it can actually change along the line. And that becomes important because somebody who is, well, you can't be psychopathic. I'll get to that in a little bit. But somebody who's really not very nice, thieves, Johnny who pulled the chair out from Freddie, etc. You can change those things by appropriate interaction. So now what's thought is that there's about 80% that's hardwired, about 20% that's flexible or plastic. And what happens is when the mRNA comes in, I think it's best described by there are what's called twin studies done in University of Minnesota. And what they did was find identical twins or families, identical twins, which were split, and one went in one family, one went to another family, and then they wanted to see what these children whose DNA by definition is exactly the same. Were they the same, which they should be if nothing changed, or were they different? And they were different. An example would be one of the kids went to UCLA, or California. UCLA is California. Yeah, anyway. They went to California. Another one went to New York. In New York, the kid was adopted by a crime family. In California, the kid was adopted by a hippie-esque group family. And the kid in New York became a thief, and generally not a very nice person. The one in California, significantly different, had a job, went to school, was philanthropic, just generally nice person. And so how could that be if genetics did not have any variability? Anyway, what happens is that the action of the environment can make changes in how the mRNA attaches itself to the DNA. So you can move from one spot to another. You can take the mRNA it gets smart, and can adjust for such things as personality. I forgot where I was here. But anyway, about 80% of what we are is hardwired and is not likely to change. We're not gonna, we're not gonna change our hair color. We have to work to change our hair color, and it's not persistent. But anyway, hardwired versus the ability to change things. Same sorts of things. Well, if you look at that, it's the same thing as the empathy. You can develop empathy with people who have little empathy. And the important part of that is that we can measure empathy with what's called an empathy quotient. And that's also mentioned in your, oops, sorry, John. In your cartoon, Bob. Now I'm going to take a little time out here and go through parts of the brain. And these parts are associated with whether we're good people, a high empathy quotient versus people who aren't so nice with a low empathy quotient. One of the things I want to put in here, those who are psychopaths cannot be changed. And the reason they cannot be changed in general is that they have a dysfunctional brain at this level, which are the different named parts of brain. Well, you'll see what happens. I'll just describe what these different parts do, and then you can figure out, well, what would happen if one of these parts is non-functional. It may not have anything to do with your genetics. It may be an injury, or it could have something to do with genetics in that you just don't have that part. It just wasn't there. These are just named parts, and the named parts then were identified by these study quotients where the patient was shown something, some sort of stimulus, picture, noise, words, all kinds of things, and then a PET scan was done and showed where the brain lighted up. So somatosensory cortex, that's my green part there. And St. Patrick's Day cortex. This is the visual reaction to others' physical pain. And an example of this, I'll go back to medical school. In medical school, when the first shows, the first movies of operations are shown, 10% of the students pass out. Okay? So it's physical reaction to what appears to be someone else's pain. Number 2, which I have here in black, is the inferior parietal lobe, and this is active in mirroring other people's reactions to emotions. Number 3, purple, superior temporal sulcus, reading eye expressions. These are all, I got these off this drawing, but they were so small and hard to read that I figured I better pick up the size a little bit. So the superior temporal sulcus is reading eye expressions and movements of others. People are really responsive to different eye movements. That's why eyes can be used, I think, in turning on your phone. And it's not just the retina, it's the retina or the back of the eye. That's not everything that's used for identification. It's other parts. And the identification is in conversation when you're talking with somebody. We're almost always looking at eyes. And you look at other parts as well, and other parts, I tried to raise my eyebrows, but I also move other parts of my face as well. But eyes are one of the most important parts of us understanding what other people want or are talking about. Then the red here is the temporoparietal junction. You can see I didn't learn all of these real well. It's a little slow coming out here. This is imagining the thoughts of others. Inferior frontal gyrus, that's this one, and it registers facial emotion, so a broader part than just eyes. The frontal operculum, and where the heck is that? Right there. Comprehending the intentions of others. The yellow one here is the anterior insula. It's important in recognizing emotions, pain, and self-awareness. The red one, the amygdala, is of particular importance for this talk, and that is that the amygdala is learned emotional responses, processes distressing stimuli, and if what's really neat about it is that it's bigger with people who have a big empathy quotient. So if you're a good guy, you have a big amygdala, which can actually be measured. You can look at it not so much on the PET scan, but on an MRI scan, for example. You can measure size of a particular organ. And psychopaths have very little, if any, active amygdala. The middle cingulate cortex, and that's up there. It recognizes pain. The medial prefrontal cortex, blue, excuse me, it compares one's perspective with others. And the purple is the orbitofrontal cortex, and that's understanding social cues and physical pain. Now this one becomes really important for me in dealing with kids with ADHD. Many of them have problems with their frontal cortex area, and they don't understand what a person's facial expression or a person's expressions mean. So we'll be back to Freddie who pulled the chair out, and the teacher's just gives him one of those. So Sally is over in the corner just going nuts because the teacher's mad at Freddie. Okay, well, Freddie doesn't care. He doesn't give a darn because he doesn't recognize the teacher's angry with him. He has no clue. There's nothing going on. So he just doesn't get it. Now, you can teach this sort of thing. You can explain that sort of thing to kids, and they'll gradually start to learn some of it, but not all of it. So again, the empathetic quotient, plus versus minus. And then the prefrontal cortex, sort of, this is a 2D view, but it's basically on both sides, up in front of these other pieces. And the prefrontal cortex restrains impulsive behaviors. Again, the kids with ADHD have problems with that. If they see something, they impulsively act on it, and that gets them in trouble. And that's another reason for them repeating behaviors that get them in trouble. They just can't, because of the inability of that part of the brain to do what it's supposed to do, they can't control the impulse. So the impulse happens, and mom was mad, and there's a consequence, and 10 minutes later, he did the same thing. Mom got mad, he had the consequence. 2 hours later, he did the same thing. Mom got mad, had a consequence, and then asked him what he did wrong. And he explained to her what was wrong. Well, why didn't you stop it? Because he has little impulse control. So all of these kinds of things, when you pull one component out, you can see that if it doesn't work right, you really have pretty significant problems in social interaction. And then another thing that with the empathy quotient is that we all have some empathy quotient. Most of us are gathered in the middle where we have some good, some bad. Psychopaths being terrible, and they really just can't be managed very well because they don't have the components to teach management. The others are on the far end are called extreme altruists, and there's several different descriptions of what extreme altruism would be. So for example, somebody donating a kidney to somebody they have no idea, they don't know who it is. A couple of examples, one was a woman was watching out her kitchen window, and she could see that someone in the wheelchairs was stuck in a railroad track and couldn't get the wheelchair out. And toot toot, the train's coming. And so she takes the kid next door, leaves it with the neighbor, runs out, and tries to get the wheelchair out of the track. And the wheelchair is not coming out of the track. So finally, she gets a hold of the guy and hauls him out of the wheelchair not long before the train hits the wheelchair and spattered it for a mile. So it's the extreme altruists are doing things for others at extreme risk to themselves. And they have a really high empathy quotient, as opposed to the novels that Marlene likes to read, the psychopaths, and she likes murder mysteries. You haven't gotten any more insurance on me lately, have you? Then what makes this sort of thing? How come we're so different? Why wouldn't we all be the same? Usually there's a development of something like this, like eye color, hair color, body size, skin color, all of those things. There's a genetic advantage for each of those traits, and they're developed somewhere along the line of developing humans. So why aren't we the same? And I like the answer to that question in here, and that is that when people developed early, they lived in tribes, large family units. So being nice to those people kept you safe. And understanding when the chief said it's time to sit down, you sat down, and you could tell that he meant business because you could read his eyes, his facial expression. However, 10 miles away is Tribe B, and Tribe B is taking all your food. Okay, well, you got to go over there and kill Tribe B, because you can't eat and you can't survive if you don't get rid of Tribe B. So we've got stuff on both sides, the extreme altruists and the much less altruistic. But we have to do both to survive. So anyway, that's, I think, a pretty good answer as to why those things happen. I'm going to read the reading I exchanged for the one that was in the program. Greg Stanton is someone who studies this sort of thing. He's the former U.S. State Department official and founder of Genocide Watch, a nonprofit that works to prevent mass murder. He has identified the stages that can cause otherwise decent people to commit murder. It starts, and I want this particular part, it just sort of hit me that we're seeing a lot of this by a certain person. It starts when demagogic leaders define a target group as, quote, the other, and claim it is a threat to the interests of his supporters. Discrimination follows, and soon the leaders characterize their targets as subhuman, eroding the in-group's empathy for the other. Next, society becomes polarized. Those planning the genocide say, "You are either with us or against us," says Stanton. This is followed by a phase of preparation with the architects of the genocide drawing up death lists, stocking weapons, and planning how the rank and file are to execute the killings. Members of the out group are sometimes forced to move into ghettos or concentration camps. Then the massacre begins. Many of the perpetrators remain untouched by remorse, not because they are incapable of feeling it. In other words, their brains would look okay on our drawing here, as is the case with the psychopaths, which can't manage this. I mean, they're not going to change. But because they find ways to rationalize the killings. James Weller, a genocide scholar at Keene State College in New Hampshire, says he got a glimpse of this incredible capacity of human mind to make sense of and to justify the worst of actions. When he interviewed dozens of Hutu men convicted of or accused of committing atrocities during the Rwanda genocide, some of them had children, even those they personally knew, to death. Their rationale, according to Walter, was, quote, "If I didn't do this, those children would have grown up to come back and kill me," end quote. This is something that was a necessity for my people to be safe, for my people to survive. That was the end of the quote there. So that's sort of the end of how we get to evil through chemistry. So I talked about chemistry, anatomy, physiology, and the genetics of how brains work, and a description of how people and individuals react that shows why humans are considered the most complicated of beasts. We better finish. So.